When I was a kid in Los Angeles, my family lived in a house on a small suburban cul-de-sac, surrounded by a lot of other houses, filled with families just like ours, all striving for the middle class. This was my house. It was a safe place to be a kid, and those on my street roamed in packs, flowing from one house to the next in a great progressive play date. One day when I came home for dinner, my parents asked where I'd been playing that afternoon. Mexico, I replied. I'd been visiting my friends across the street. In my house, it was just me and my parents, but in their house, it was full of 4 brothers and sisters, plus aunts and uncles and cousins, all entering and exiting, speaking Spanish and English, and a smattering of the two combined. They were from Mexico, they were Mexican, and so in my 6-year-old head, when I was at their house, I was in another country. As a child, my understanding of the world, borders followed people. So in our house, for example, it was California, Idaho, and Texas. My friend's house was Mexico. My dad pulled out a map and showed me where Mexico actually was in relationship to me, and my concept of the world shifted. After that, whenever we traveled, I'd sit in the back seat of the car with an atlas, and I'd watch out the window for that exact place where one state turned instantly into another. I was disappointed and honestly pretty suspicious that all the lines I could see on the map weren't visible out in the world. The map isn't the place is a lesson I've carried with me ever since then, along with a continued interest in and curiosity about that US-Mexico border that I misplaced as a kid. Over the past few years, as the national conversation about our southern border has increased in heat and intensity, I'm often bothered that many seem to base their opinions on what they see on maps, which often don't reveal what actually exists in the world. I wish every American could visit the border and see it for themselves. Sadly, I can't gather everybody up and go on a great progressive field trip, but maybe I can. As an artist, I make sense of the world visually. So I got to thinking that if I could find a scale model, a physical scale model of the border, I could share it with people, especially those who've never been there, and help them better understand the complexity. You'll likely be as surprised as I was to learn that such a scale model doesn't exist. So I decided to make one, using satellite images to better reveal what the lines on the map don't show us. I dove into Google Earth and gathered up little pieces of the border and stitched them together in a photo editing program. I started at the surf break in Tijuana and slowly copied, pasted, and aligned over 2,000 little pieces of the border until I was spit out in the Gulf of Mexico. Here you can see the segments that make up the border between California and Baja California. In its finished form, my entire project consists of nearly 200 pieces like these, each 10 feet in length. At this scale, 1 foot equals 1 mile. And if laid end to end, the entire thing would measure nearly 1/3 of a mile in length. 2,000 miles in miniature, short enough to easily walk along, yet detailed enough to study, notice, and wonder. In my facsimile of the border, you can see the shadow from the wall, and you can pick out what are probably Border Patrol vehicles. You can also see the very different approaches to living with the wall. On one side, life comes right up to it. On the other side, thousands of acres of land are given over to security infrastructure and little else. From my omniscient perspective as I worked on this project, the land came to life in beautiful ways. I followed patchwork patterns of irrigated fields that led me to arid regions where monsoonal rains have sculpted the sides of mesas and arroyos carve lazy meanders across the desert. Human trails are visible too, and these lines often seem to dance with those made by natural elements. As I worked, I dropped location markers on interesting finds, and on those days when I developed borderline fever and could not bear to clip another mile for my project, I'd revisit these places and study their often strange beauty. One day, inspired by idleness and procrastination, I pasted an interesting segment of arroyo into my photo editor. I made copies of it and rearranged it, and I turned that arroyo into something else. And then I made duplicates of this and stitched them together, and in the process, I found something familiar, I'd seen patterns like these before in the ceramics and weavings of the American Southwest and North Mexico. I became obsessed with what I could make from the lines I was finding in the landscape. And so I made one pattern after another and started recombining them into ever bigger and more complex compositions. I started thinking of them as weavings, with the lines that run north and south serving as the warp, and then the delicate patterns of the desert forming the weft. It's kind of an apt metaphor for the ways that history and culture collide at the actual border. As I worked, I wondered about what life was really like on the ground in the places where I was harvesting these lines. So as I'd start a weaving, I'd research its locale. The stories I found amazed me, angered me, and broke my heart. I'd like to share some with you. On the left is a region that stretches from southern Arizona to the Sea of Cortez. On the right is the weaving I made from lines that I found here. This weaving's made from land that belongs to the Tohono O'odham people, who've lived here for thousands of years, long before the idea of the United States or Mexico. When the Southwest was annexed to the United States, that newly drawn border kind of swerved around this sovereign nation. They called the border an imaginary line, and until recently, it hasn't had much of an effect on their lives. There's no word for wall in the Tohono O'odham language. Yet a couple of years ago, construction began on a very real wall that now slices through the middle of this reservation. It makes that imaginary line visible and has a huge impact on daily life. If we could all go there, I'd like to talk to this rancher whose land has been sliced in half by the border wall. His house is in the United States. His water is now in Mexico. What used to be a short walk to his well is now a half-day excursion. He has to drive dozens of miles off the reservation to an official crossing, cross the border, and then drive dozens of miles back to walk on his own land. I learned of residents in 3 Tohono O'odham villages who used to live a short, direct drive to larger Tohono O'odham towns with essential services. Now, because of the wall and new border crossing requirements, these people are a 3-hour drive each way to groceries and medical care. Imagine being a kid in this beautiful land of red and yellow earth, scampering safely between the houses of family and friends, being able to walk by yourself to visit your grandparents. But now with the wall, these visits often require lengthy drives. And when you live in poverty, there often isn't that much gasoline in the tank. Border crossings cause extra stresses and difficulties for those who only speak the Tohono O'odham language. There's stories of abuses, of being asked to speak in O'odham or to perform songs and dances to prove tribal membership before being allowed to cross. The lines on the map don't tell us these stories. One thing I've become most intrigued by as I've worked on this are those parts of the border given over to border crossing infrastructure. And nowhere is this more prominent than in Tijuana, which is the 4th busiest border crossing in the world. You can see it here on the left. On the right is a weaving I made from patterns I found in these buildings. When you hear the words illegal immigrant, what comes to mind? Many folks will respond, Mexican or Central American. Interestingly, according to the US State Department, 1.3 million Americans live illegally in Mexico. Nearly 100,000 live in Tijuana, and they cross the border every day to work their jobs in San Diego. Their reasons? Housing, food, and healthcare. These Americans are economic refugees in Mexico. In San Diego, the average cost for a 1-bedroom apartment is more than $2,000 a month. In Tijuana, the same can be had for $350 a month. Mexican food prices are often half that for the same products in American supermarkets. Consumer costs in San Diego are nearly 200% higher than those in Tijuana. And when you compare things like costs for childcare, you'll find differences that are often tenfold or more. So these very real cost savings have driven Americans to live undocumented lives south of the border. But many point to another less tangible reason for their choice, and that is, in Mexico, being poor isn't viewed as a character flaw. So what do you do when your job doesn't pay you enough so you can live where you work? If you're like these folks, you draw a new map for your life. But the lines on the official maps don't tell us these stories. On the left is a region that sweeps eastward from Yuma, Arizona. And on the right is one of my favorite weavings, the red and yellow, dark gray and soft white I found in an area around El Camino del Diablo, the Devil's Highway. This is a prehistoric and colonial trail that cuts through the Sonoran Desert. It's a region teeming with life. There are desert bighorn sheep, kangaroo rats, jackrabbits, saguaro cacti. There are 5 different kinds of rattlesnakes here. You would think one kind of rattlesnake would be enough, but no, they have 5. Even discounting the rattlesnakes, it's an area that's hostile to human life. Air temperatures regularly exceed 115 degrees, and the ground temperature can reach 180 degrees. The evaporation rate is 40 times the annual rainfall. The average adult human needs 2 gallons of water a day to survive in these conditions. Without water, life expectancy can be a matter of hours. Part of the wall between the states of Arizona and Sonora was intentionally placed so as to push migrants out into this region. It was thought it would discourage illegal crossings in safer locations closer to Yuma. Unfortunately, a lot of migrants aren't following maps. They're trusting in coyotes, smugglers they've paid to see them safely across. In 2000, 26 Mexican men and boys were left in this place by smugglers who told them that if they just kept walking another couple of hours, they'd reach a highway. In reality, there was 50 miles of desert between them and the nearest road. So there they were, little water, lousy directions, and triple-digit temperatures. 5 days later, 14 of them were dead. Imagine being there, the sun pounding down on your head, and heat intense as an oven radiating up from the ground. At first, you'd feel thirsty. And when thirst kicks in, your body hangs on to every drop of moisture. You sweat less, your body temperature rises, and then your blood thickens and its flow becomes sluggish. To maintain oxygen levels, your heart has to beat faster. After a while, you'll stop sweating. Your blood becomes so concentrated, the decreased flow will cause your skin to shrivel. Your blood pressure will drop, and you'll probably faint. The difficulty maintaining blood pressure causes your body to divert the flow away from organs that are less essential than your heart. So your kidneys will likely be the first to fail, followed shortly thereafter by the rest. A Border Patrol officer working the rescue said that if you've seen photographs of mummies taken from ancient Egyptian tombs, you can imagine what these souls looked like when they were found. The lines on the map don't tell us these stories. After I'd worked on these weavings for a while, I turned back to my scale model border project. You see, in all those hundreds of pieces I'd stitched together, I'd avoided dealing with the one thing that drove me to make this in the first place, the border, that inconvenient line. What to do with it? I didn't want to obscure it because there's nothing to be learned from that erasure. I wanted it to be visible and relate to the land and the stories it holds, but I didn't want it to dominate and be the main story. In Japan, there's a tradition known as kintsugi, where broken ceramics are repaired using a lacquer that's infused with gold, silver, or platinum. In this way, the original beauty of the vessel is preserved, and a new beauty in the fracture is discovered. I started thinking about the US-Mexico border as a fracture in need of repair. And so, inspired by kintsugi, I decided to use metal leaf to make the border in my work visible. I chose copper mainly because some of the world's biggest copper mines have been in this part of the world, and it's a material that's shared by many of the cultures who've lived here. But copper is also a humble material. Think about how many pennies you've stepped over in your life and not bothered to pick up. I think more than anything, its humbleness makes copper the perfect material to use to heal this fracture and to highlight the beauty in this line. So I can't collect you all up and take you on a great progressive field trip to visit the border in person, but I can take you there through my art. In exchange, I have a favor to ask. The next time you think about the border, pull out a map, close your eyes, and drop your finger anywhere along that 2,000-mile line. Open your eyes and look at where your finger has landed. Know that beneath it, there are dozens of stories like the ones I've shared with you today, waiting for you to hear them. The map isn't the place. These stories are.